Good day to everyone joining us for this session of the Bloomberg Equality Summit. I'm really happy to be joined by three eminent scholars for our conversation today. We have Kehinde Andrews, who's a professor of Black Studies at Birmingham, City University in the UK. Katherine Franke, who is a professor of law at Columbia University. And Glenn Lowry, who is a professor of social sciences and economics at Brown University. So thank you all for joining us today. The title for our discussion is The Black Wealth Gap, Economic Opportunity, Reparations, and the Path to Financial Equity. And we will talk about the Black Wealth Gap and how to address it. But first, I'd like to ask each one of you this question to start us off, which is, does the United States have a moral duty to pay reparations? And there are many kinds of reparations that could be paid, but to pay those as a moral duty, as a recognition that it enslaved an estimated 10 to 12 million Africans in our past. Professor Andrews, let's start with you. You're in the UK, as I mentioned, but you have studied and written extensively about the history of US slavery as well as Britain's colonial past. So what would you say?
Well, I think it's not just a moral issue, it's really a legal issue. The idea and concept in law of reparations is well established. If you look after the Holocaust, the reparations were paid to the Jews who were victims of the Holocaust. If you look in America, there's been some kind of token reparations paid to certain native communities. I mean, if you look at this, is not a moral issue, it's simply a legal one. There was, for hundreds of years, unpaid labor was extracted from enslaved Africans. There was no payment was ever given. People were brought over to the country, and then were supposed to celebrate somehow they've been emancipated, but emancipated into conditions of extreme poverty. And the legacy of that is still with us today. I mean, there's a reason why we're having Black Lives Matter protests, and the very reason you have so many Black Americans today is because of slavery. And the wealth from slavery is still very much shaping the US, and the poverty from slavery is still very much shaping the US. So, of course, there needs to be restitution, but that's not a moral issue. That's simply a legal and perfectly rational one as well.
Professor Franke, what would you say?
Well, I've actually written a whole book on this, Repair, Redeeming the Promise of Abolition. And in that book, I look back at what actually happened to formerly enslaved people as they were emancipated, even before the end of the Civil War. And there were a number of locations in the South, the Sea Islands in South Carolina and outside Vicksburg, Mississippi, where Northern military officials understood that reparations were owed to formerly enslaved people. As a moral matter, at that point, not so much as a legal matter, because the law was not really framing the discussion at that point. And reparations were given. Land was allocated to formerly enslaved people to create free Black communities in those locations. And then that land was stolen from them and returned to their former owners. So not only is it something that we continue to have an obligation to provide today, but it's not a modern radical idea. It was one that white people understood was expected and owed at the time in 1861, 62, 63. So what we did is we freed Black people, but we never really rendered them free. They needed resources to be truly free people, and we're still living with that intergenerational debt. As Martin Luther King said, during the Mississippi Poor People's Campaign, they're still waiting for their check.
Professor Lowry, what's your view on this?
Yeah, I'm going to take a contrarian view. I mean, let me start by acknowledging what has been said here, which is that there was a historical crime and people were dispossessed. Those people were due more than what they got. That was 150 years ago. The question before us now is, what do we do with the people who are here now? My concerns for the United States are several. I loathe the idea that we would partition ourselves based upon race into categories of persons whom we would then have the state make transfers based on those categories. That smacks of a South African style essentialization of racial categories. That disturbs me. I worry about the implications for our politics. This is a gift issue to the right wing of the country's political landscape, and they would mine it for decades, mine the resentment and the reaction for decades. We needn't give them that. But most fundamentally, I worry that the obligations to present day descendants of slaves are obligations, in effect, to all American citizens. And if we were to commodify and discharge the debt with a financial recognition, we would close the door on what should be an open-ended obligation to deal with our citizens fairly.
Yeah, and I've read your writings about that and some of the conversations you had, that you fear that, once reparations are enacted, that somehow then relieves us of an obligation to create a fairer, more equitable society and world. But Dr. Franke, what would you say to that argument that that reparations closes the door to a further discussion about how to create a more equitable world?
Well, we need to have laws that prohibit race discrimination in employment, housing, education, access to everything, as a matter of what it means to live in a just society today. Whether we had a history of slavery or not, every society should have that. What we're specifically talking about is the collective reckoning with one of the founding evils and sins in the United States, which is the institution of slavery that has structured our economy, our political reality, and our culture. We've come to terms with many other past wrongs in this country, but never really fully with slavery. And I think one of the shocking things about it is we're losing ground in dealing with it the longer we wait. Slavery was officially abolished 155 years ago, but it would take the average Black household 288 years to catch up now to the family wealth in similarly situated white households. So the accumulation of time and the accumulation of inequality and what I would call a badge of inferiority that Black people in this country continue to bear has had real economic costs and consequences that we must take account of, because it will only get worse. It won't get better unless we look frankly and I think in an uncomfortable way at that history and its consequences.
Professor Andrews, as I mentioned, obviously you're in the UK. Right before our conversation, we had the chief operating officer of the Bank of England, which earlier had apologized for some of its role in slavery. As I understand it, the apology was that they hadn't directly been involved in the slave trade, but they were acknowledging that they had been in some ways a part of it by extending credit, for example. You were critical of that apology earlier. Why was that?
Well, it's this idea that there's two real problems with the way we understand slavery and its impact. One is that it was a long time ago, and so therefore it's past. And two is only those people who owned slaves or traded in Africans who are culpable. The Bank of England was absolutely directly involved in slavery. It couldn't have happened without the Bank of England, which was the central bank, which kind of underpinned the whole entire banking system, which was necessary for slavery to happen. And I mean, the best example of just how involved and that ties into this reparations debate, is when for Britain to abolish slavery, it had to make the largest payment the government has ever made in reparations payments to the slave owners. It was 40% of government income at the time, 5% of GDP, approximately 100 billion pounds in today's money. And they had to take a loan, which was so big that they only paid back the loan in 2015, which means that myself and my grandmother, who were descended from the enslaved, have actually been paying back reparations payments to slave owners. And who did they take this loan from? The Bank of England. So for the Bank of England to turn around and say, "Oh, we were not really involved," it just shows how terrible our understanding of this issue is. And the fact that we're still paying this debt off in 2015 should be a reminder that this isn't an issue that's past. You can't talk about the black wealth gap without talking about slavery. That's where it comes from.
Right, and Dr. Franke, you write about this as well in your book, which was issued last year, and which I commend to our audience to read. Reparations were paid, as they were in the UK. They were paid to slave owners, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, the land that was seized in order to provide reparations to Black people was later, the people who had owned that land, the enslavers, the plantation owners, were compensated for the taking of that land after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. It was part of a package of repudiation of reparations that President Johnson put in place, where he restored all of the property of the former enslavers. And if they weren't able to take that property back, they were paid for it. Around the same time, the U.S. West was opened up for settlement and homesteads for white people. So free land was being given away to white people to settle the United States, the western part of the United States, with financing and support from the United States government at the very same time that land was being stolen from Black people who had recently been enslaved, and they were forced then to enter into labor contracts with their former enslavers. That's what it meant to be freed, but not really free. And what it meant also was locking Black people, formerly enslaved people, into a permanent intergenerational status of second-class citizenship and peasantry, really. And that's what Professor Dr. Andrews was describing as this intergenerational legacy of a two-tiered society where white people enjoy a different kind of freedom than Black people do. And we can trace that in the United States directly back to the ways in which we failed as a society to fully eradicate the institution of slavery by providing reparations and a real material possibility for Black people to be free at the end of the Civil War.
So, Professor Lowry, as a professor of economics who has looked at these issues and obviously others around economic equality, how do you account for the Black wealth gap that exists, which is profound and has been persistent, obviously?
Yeah, it's partly the result of history, to be sure. People pass assets down across generations within families. But it's also partly a result of the failure of our society to fully develop the human potential of the people who are living today and who lived most recently. That is to say, wealth is not simply a thing that's there. It's something that gets created. It doesn't fall from the sky. It's the consequence of human agency. So I look to the long history of Jim Crow segregation, of the inadequate social provision, education, of blocked opportunity discrimination in labor markets and capital markets, of racism in the commercial sector of the society over the many decades since slavery as another factor helping to contribute to the wealth gap. May I say something else?
Yes, please.
I mean, I'll say it very briefly. When we talk about Black people and white people, we are engaging in an aggregation of a vastly heterogeneous set of populations. White people are not just white. They are Irish and Italian and Polish and Slavic. They are the descendants of workers who were exploited as well as of landowners who exploited. Black people are not simply Black. We are the product of wave after wave of immigration from non-European sources, from Africa and from the Caribbean. Some Black people are of mixed race ancestry and all the rest. When we try to take on this project of going back and correcting history's wrongs, we essentialize these categories in ways that are unhealthy for the future of our democratic republic. I speak now of the United States of America. There are just Americans here. There shouldn't be Black Americans and white Americans cutting deals with one another across a bargaining table.
So
Professor Andrews, you disagree?
Yes, go ahead.
Because no, that's a really nice. That sounds like poetry, right? We'd all like to think that. But the reality is, both America and the UK and the West more generally is built on the idea of these racialized concepts. And whether you like to think that there are not Black Americans, there are Black Americans. If you're a Black American, you are far more likely to have less wealth. You're far more likely to be stopped and shot by the police. You're far more likely to live in inner city, crowded neighborhood. There is a reality to this, whether we would like to believe it or not. And that reality is shaped heavily by the history of slavery. This is not something that has gone. That category of the Negro, of the Black, whose life doesn't matter. That's what Black Lives Matter is about. Is still with us. So whether we like to dream is not the case. It is the case. And if you want to actually have any restitution for any of those issues, you have to have talking about wealth. I mean, the estimates are between 4.9 and $15 trillion is owed to African Americans. If you imagine, and if you want to solve the issues of housing inequality, education, etc., you're going to need that money because we live in a capitalist society. So we can dream as much as we like about no Black America, white America, but the reality is we see again and again and again is that's just not the case.
Professor Franke, that's a huge number that Professor Andrews just posited, and you wrote about this as well. For people today, who think, well, my family was not involved in the slave trade, or that was so long ago, how do we wrap our heads around this? You have some ideas that you put forth in your book about how we could approach a collective repair of the past. Give us some examples.
I do. And as I travel around the country talking about this issue, so often I get well-meaning white people saying, look, my parents, my family, my grandparents came to the United States well after the institution of slavery was over. What kind of responsibility do I have for this? And what I would say is that this country remains structured around a kind of power, a kind of ideology of white supremacy that burdens all Black people, as complicated as that category is, as Dr. Lowry notes, but burdens all Black people with a badge of inferiority and endows white people with a kind of privilege and a wind at our back that we didn't earn. And I would say, of course, that Black people didn't earn this badge of inferiority. An interesting thing to note is that Dr. Lowry and I grew up in the same town. He could have been my elder brother. He grew up on the south side of Chicago. I was born on the north side of Chicago, in fact, right at the border of Evanston. He talks about how he and his friends were stopped on the Dan Ryan Expressway by the cops with some frequency. My family didn't have a lot of money when I was younger, but little by little took nest eggs and were able to move us up to the northern wealthy suburbs in a way that I'm sure his family never could have. My family wasn't special. We were white. We had access to white privilege that was part of the American dream that Black people have never had access to in the same way systematically. And that's why I think we as white people have to take some kind of account for, reckon with, and be willing to surrender the kind of endowments that we have by virtue of our whiteness as a collective matter, whether we have a genetic relationship to the actual enslavement of Black people or not. So it's about understanding this intergenerational transfer, not just of wealth, but of privilege and advantage that I am an inadvertent and lucky beneficiary of, that I feel I have a moral obligation to take some responsibility for.
Professor Lowry, what do you say to that?
I say I understand the psychology of it, but I do worry about the politics and the morality of it going forward. Looking backward is one thing, going forward is another. On the politics front, I repeat, you want to empower the reactionary right wing with a club that they'll beat us with for decades, instantiate a multi-trillion-dollar transfer program to tens of millions of people based upon their racial identity. You think you've seen white privilege and white supremacy in the past? It's going to be nothing like the reaction that you'll get if you go down that road. I think it's very bad for the country. The other thing I would say, and forgive me, I actually, as an African American, I agree with what Dr. Franke said. I agree that it's in fact the case that my upbringing was less than what it might have been if we had had the opportunity to move out to Evanston or Rogers Park or whatever it might be from the South Side ghetto. I agree with that. Nothing can be done about that. Okay, we can't go back and do that over again. For African Americans to think of ourselves primarily in terms of the fact of our historical victimization is a burden, not an advantage. It inhibits us from realizing our full human potential. It leads us to look to white people to deliver us from the conditions of history. I don't want to rely upon that. I want to rely upon, at the end of the day, my own agency. That's not a pull yourself up by the bootstrap speech. It's a claim to the dignity that comes from being in command of your own life and not having to look to others to deliver you.
Well, in fact,
if I
you
can
wrote,
respond to that.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Franke.
Mark, just very quickly, part of what my project, my intellectual and academic project, but also my political project is to talk to white people. Not to say to Black people, it's okay if you make a demand for reparations, but to speak to white people and say, you have a responsibility to disgorge the wages of whiteness. And so part of what I recommend is that we think about an estate tax, increasing the estate tax so that the intergenerational wealth and advantage that is passing right now in the largest intergenerational wealth transfer we've ever seen in this planet, from my parents' generation to my generation, can be partly recaptured, recouped through an increased estate tax to put into a trust. I don't recommend writing individual checks to Black people. And there's some people who are interested in reparations and have worked on it a long time who do take that position. I think we need to think more collectively than individually. But I think we as white people have to take responsibility for and disgorge, if you will, those advantages of whiteness in order to create a kind of leveling of that intergenerational disadvantage and advantage that is so racially stratified in this country. So my message is to white people that this is work we have to do, not just a demand that Black people are making upon us, but a moral demand we should be making on ourselves.
Professor Andrews, how do you think of reparations? How would that work? What would your ideas be?
Well, I mean, there is the only real question of reparations is how you do it. I mean, really, I mean, look, if we want to solve any of these problems and we accept that African Americans are at least 4.9 trillion dollars, behind, and we talk about this as though they're historic. I mean, the mass incarceration, for example, is a relatively new phenomenon. If you look at the wealth gap, you look at the conditions people are living in, is maybe worse in many ways over the last 30 years. So let's not pretend this is something historic. The problem is still with us. So if America, and I'm actually talk about radical revolution most of the time, but if you want to make a more optimistic, can we reform, can African Americans be part of the society, then you have to deal with the fact that they're at least 4.9 trillion pounds behind, and that explains a large part of why there's so many problems in the communities. So you would have to say we have to have a massive transfer of wealth. I would definitely say it's not individual, shouldn't be given out to individuals. It should be done in a way which is collective, which can respond, and which can mean that because we're basically working at this huge deficit. And there's no way you can solve the problems of racism, which we're supposedly all interested in now after the Black Lives Matter movement, without dealing with that issue of money. How else could you possibly solve any of these problems?
Professor Lowry, I want to come back though to this question of how do you close this wealth gap, if not through something like a collective action, as described by our other panelists. How would you tackle closing that Black wealth gap? What are your answers to that?
Well, I wouldn't want to look at it in terms of race. And I understand we're talking about reparations for slavery here, so this is not going to necessarily go over so well. Look, there are more poor white people than there are poor Black people. More white people killed by police than are Black people killed by police, although at a higher rate. There's a lot wrong, I speak now of the United States, with our social and economic organization. We don't have universal health care for people who need it. There are too many Americans in prison and too many Black Americans in prison. We have guns everywhere. We have a punitive politics. We have too much money in our politics. There's a lot wrong. If we could get housing for people who are not well housed, if we could get health care for people who need it, if we could get educational opportunity as it should be for all of our citizens, we wouldn't be talking about racial gaps. We would be building a better society for everybody. Again, I know how that sounds. It sounds like pie in the sky, but I'm insisting politically it's the only way. You don't get anything done in a democracy without 50% of the population. We need to frame our demands in ways that they can be of lasting political success and appeal to a broad coalition of our citizens. Dividing ourselves into racial groups and then bargaining across a table on that basis is the wrong way to go, I repeat.
Professor Franke, go ahead.
I was just going to directly respond to that. I mean, it just sounds like you're just talking about the New Deal. When we had this, right? Social democracy. Let's get more left wing. Let's redistribute resources. And what happened on both sides of the Atlantic? It just went to white people, and still race didn't deal with the issue of racism. That's a pie in the sky idea that if you just change it for everybody, it fixes racism. There is zero evidence that ever happened.
And it avoids the question of the institution of slavery, of our history. If you start only with the present and you say, let's make a more just future based on the baseline of today, you're avoiding And I worry about this as a country, that we avoid looking at this ugliness of our past, of the degree to which our country was founded on not just the Constitution, but even before that, back to 1691, 1641, even before that. The importation of enslaved people from Africa. This country would not have been possible without that. And it's just it's a historical horror that we have never really confronted. So if we start with the baseline of today, we avoid that national reckoning in a way that will just continue to live with us as it has for these last 155 years.
In my conversation with you before we started this panel, Dr. Franke, I asked you about something similar to what Professor Lowry has just said, which is the political climate that the United States is in at this moment, and in some ways the UK is somewhat similar. Will it allow for that kind of discussion, that kind of reckoning, or are we past that point at this moment in our history in the United States?
Well, I think the question of reparations was one which even 2 or 3 years ago, most of us thought no one was going to talk about, no presidential candidates were going to talk about. The House of Representatives and the rest of the Congress would not take up a reparations bill. But something happened in the last couple of years that we're talking about this issue seriously. It's not just a fringe issue. It's central to the political platforms of every Democrat that was running for president. It's central to our national conversation, and we're talking about it at the Bloomberg Equality Summit, which we probably might not have done a year ago even. So I think that the progress we've had in discussing this issue and mainstreaming it as a legitimate national conversation has been remarkable. We are living in an astonishingly tragic, if I can say, political time in the United States, but we're also seeing a mobilization around issues of racial justice taking place in the streets, in the media, and elsewhere in ways that I also think were unimaginable a few years ago. So I'm more than happy to be surprised that this issue will become more and more relevant to our national political conversation.